What if one of the biggest problems facing young men today isn't masculinity, but the absence of a clear path into manhood? Girls have always had cultural and physical markers that signal the transition into womanhood. But boys, in many modern societies, that bridge has disappeared. In this episode of Women on the Brink, we're exploring the missing rite of passage for boys, why many young men are searching for identity in the manosphere, and what mythologist Joseph Campbell discovered about how cultures guide boys into becoming men. Welcome back to Women on the Brink. So, today we're going to be discussing the boys and men in our lives and the rise of the manosphere and the work of Joseph Campbell. This episode was inspired actually by a conversation that I had with a woman named Jean, who actually introduced me to Joseph Campbell. And from what I understand, he was a bit of a mythologist and a writer, kind of an anthropologist in his own right. So there's an obvious moment in a girl's life when the world acknowledges that something has changed. Her body, marks the transition in the form of menstruation. And her life changes because she now knows she has the ability to bring life into the world. And historically, cultures gathered around that moment and said, something important has happened here. This girl is becoming a woman. But boys, many boys have grown up in a culture that often gives them no clear rite of passage, no ceremony, no mentorship, and no moment when somebody says, this is how a boy becomes a man. And for me, it raises an interesting question. Are boys struggling to become men today because we've stopped showing them how to cross that bridge? And are we simply expecting them to figure it out somewhere between their video games and internet forums and energy drinks, right? Like in many cultures and throughout history, boys actually did have rites of passage. And these rituals mark the transition from childhood into adulthood and clearly answered the question, like, how does a boy become a man? So this is where Joseph Campbell comes in. He was a man who spent his life studying myths and initiation rituals from cultures around the world, which is why I find him fascinating. And what he noticed was that nearly every traditional society had some form of initiation into manhood, like a structural journey that marked the end of his childhood and the beginning of his adult responsibilities. And, these rituals, they weren't just casual. They sometimes involved leaving home and facing physical challenges or psychological challenges. And usually they were being guided by elder men who had already walked that path. So, in other words, these boys weren't doing this transition to manhood on their own. They had mentorship. And Campbell described initiation as a kind of symbolic death and rebirth. So the boy had to let go of his childhood in order to return as a man. So, there's many of examples of this, even locally, but one example is the Maasai in East Africa, where boys historically went through a clearly defined initiation into manhood. And at a certain age, they would leave childhood behind and enter a stage known as becoming warriors. So, that included ceremonies and ritual trials and instruction from these elder men in the community. And then afterwards, these young men were recognized as a new social group and they had real responsibilities and they were no longer treated as children. And they were expected to protect the community and care for livestock and eventually become leaders and fathers. The important part wasn't just the ceremony, it was the clarity because the entire community acknowledged that something had changed in these boys. So I think that's the piece that's missing for today's boys is that connection, that mentorship, because the rituals don't just test boys. they connect them to something larger than themselves, to the elders and to the community and to the responsibilities waiting on the other side for them. And, they were guided and recognized and shown exactly what it meant to become a man. So I try to imagine how different that is from modern life where a boy might turn 18 and he gets a driver's license and probably a debit card or a credit card. And otherwise, he receives absolutely no guidance about what actual adulthood requires of him. There's no male mentorship. There's no initiation into manhood. There's no elders saying, here's what strength means, or here's what responsibility looks like. And here is the connection that makes you a part of something bigger. So, Joseph Campbell believed that when cultures lose these rite of passage and connections, the transition into adulthood becomes much less clear. So people still go through the biological changes of puberty, but the psychological transition, when the young man accepts that responsibility and purpose and identity, it becomes blurry. And when that transition becomes blurry, people start searching for other ways to define themselves. And that brings us to something people are talking about a lot lately, the rise of the manosphere. Now, the manosphere gets a lot of attention and often for the extreme people who are out there. But if we look a little deeper, something interesting starts to show up. So most young men aren't searching for misogyny. They're actually searching for some kind of direction. And many of the boys and young men drawn to the manosphere content are in their late teens or 20s. And that's exactly the stage of life when identity is forming and they're asking big questions like, what makes a man today and what does modern masculinity look like and where do I fit in? And lots of young men spend a lot of time online, as we know. Some feel very socially isolated. Some struggle with dating and purpose or understanding what their role is in a world that is constantly changing. And interestingly, it isn't just a certain demographic that's attracted to this manosphere ideology. I did some research. The participants in these spaces come from different racial backgrounds, different political views, and even different educational levels. Some are students, some are working, and some are still living at home with their parents, much longer than the previous generation ever did. But what many of them share is something simpler. They feel really uncertain about their place in the world. And uncertainty is very uncomfortable. So when someone online offers simple answers, clear rules about masculinity and power and relationships, it can feel like a bit of relief, even if those answers are flawed or if they're angry or even if they're really deeply unhelpful. And so I think if Joseph Campbell were alive today, he might say that many young men are still trying to go through what he calls the hero's journey. And they're just doing it without guides or elders to help them. So in Campbell's work, the hero's journey begins when someone leaves the familiar world and faces challenges, learns something important, and returns to the community transformed. So traditional rites of passage guided boys through that transformation intentionally. And today, many boys are left to wander through it all by themselves. So when you remove initiation and intentional connection, something interesting can happen. People can remain psychologically stuck in adolescence. And that's not because they're bad people or because they're lazy, but probably because no one ever clearly marked the moment when they were expected to grow into something more. Now, here's where this conversation becomes important for us women. Because emotionally mature men don't just magically appear, they have to be shaped by mentorship and responsibility and connection. So when boys grow up without strong male role models or mentorship, They will likely struggle to understand partnership, emotional responsibility, or even their own purpose. And I mean, that ripple affects relationships, families, and communities. So maybe the question isn't whether boys are failing, but maybe the deeper question is whether our culture has stopped guiding them. So, what's the solution? Well, we don't necessarily need ancient warrior rituals or dramatic survival tests in the wilderness, although there's nothing wrong with that either. But boys do need intentional guidance into adulthood. They need mentors like fathers and coaches and uncles and teachers and older men who are willing to say, here is what strength looks like. Men who are emulating that themselves. And I think the young men need responsibility, like opportunities to contribute or to protect or to lead, and to feel that their actions and what they do matters to their families and their community. They need community, people who recognize when they step into maturity and treat them differently because of it. And probably most importantly, they need a moment where someone says, you're no longer a boy, you're becoming a man, and here's what that means. Because when boys are guided into manhood, mentorship, responsibility, connection, they don't have to search the internet for answers about masculinity. They grow into it. So maybe the real opportunity in front of us right now isn't just diagnosing a crisis of masculinity. It's actually about rebuilding the bridge that helps boys cross into manhood with more clarity and a strong sense of purpose and a sense of belonging.